everyone. Welcome to another Telgorithm webinar. We really appreciate you being here with us today. We're super excited. My name is Samantha, and I'm a marketing manager here at Telgorithm, and I am extremely proud to be joined by not only our CEO and co-founder, Aaron Alter, but also by Andre Arancibia. Andre is the CEO and founder of OnlySales CRM, a leading SMS application designed to make A2P 10 DLC messaging easy for health advisors. Andre brought his company, OnlySales, over to Telgorithm in mid to late 2023 at the height of the A2P 10 DLC industry shifts and regulatory changes and cutoffs. I'm sure some or many of you here today can relate to those challenges that ensued. It was a crazy time. Therefore, Andre's story is really amazing. We can't wait to dive in with him. We're very lucky and fortunate that he came to join us today. So without further ado, let's please welcome both Aaron and Andre.
Thanks so much, Samantha, and thanks for setting these up as always. I know that a lot of work goes into them, so really appreciate that. And thanks, Andre, for taking the time out of your busy day to join us. I'm looking forward to having a really good conversation today.
Yeah, of course. Always great speaking with you guys.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Thanks, guys. So we'll take a quick look at the agenda, just so everyone knows what's coming up. So we're going to have Andre introduce his company, OnlySales, and give more details. We're going to go through some of his biggest 10 DLC pain points of 2023, his story of switching from Telnex, his previous provider, over to Telgorithm, the results of switching with Telgorithm and the company growth he's seen, and then any final thoughts. So that's what we're looking at. You guys ready to get started?
Sure.
Totally. And by the way, thanks everyone for joining, whether it's live today or at a future point. That's greatly appreciated. We put this content mostly for the industry in general. Obviously, we're geared towards Telgorithm, but we, if you've watched any of our prior videos, which I would highly encourage anyone joining to watch and read, we try to provide a lot of information that in this industry is many times convoluted. So again, appreciate everyone joining and looking forward to a great convo here. That said, let's jump right into it. Andre, so you want to slide over here. OnlySales, tell the audience a little bit about OnlySales, what it is, what you do, what's special about your industry, your vertical, and what you guys do.
Sure, no problem. I guess to really explain it, we have to go over like how it was founded. Basically how it started is I was working on private health insurance. It's a very high-paced sales industry, and we were doing the majority of our sales over the phone. Every agent gets licensed in a group of states spread throughout the country, and then the majority of the sales are done over the phone. And being such a high-paced industry, you have agents being on the phone from as early as 8 a.m. all the way out until 10 p.m., rotating the schedules throughout the country as the time progresses throughout the day, calling all the way out into the California coastline at the end of the day, basically. And yeah, in this like high-paced industry, agents are always in a state of looking for the best, most involved way to reach as many people as possible that they have access to get as many sales as possible. While working there, they had a couple of platforms that they used for managing their leads, platforms for distributing leads to agents from the office, but also platforms for the agents themselves to track the leads that they were speaking to and to contact those leads at the appropriate times. One of the platforms that they had was specifically set up towards SMS marketing and or towards SMS contacting the leads that they were getting. And the major pain point with that platform, as well as the other one that they had at the time, was how slow they operated and also how difficult it was to upload leads and to set them up throughout the process of today you'll get this message, tomorrow you'll get the other. So the original OnlySales wasn't even called that. It was called Tribe Sales, and it was a white labeled version of Go High Level. Along with an extension that we built on top of it, which modified the way in which High Level rendered at the extension level. So the app loads in, and then the extension overwrites the majority of what the app is doing. And then using the High Level API, we added customized buttons and interactions into the app. And that took us to a certain degree until we realized that there was a lot of stuff that we could do if we had control of the entire thing from start to finish and didn't just modify the browser take. So we started
Wow.
redesigning the app from there, and then we completely migrated into our own code base as of like August of 2022, originally starting with Telnex and then eventually using you guys as the main carrier that powers the application.
Awesome. Thanks for that. That's pretty amazing. Can you talk a little bit about text messaging in particular and that function and feature of this application that you built and why it's so important for the users of the application to have that streamlined and why they have it in general, and why that's so important for this industry?
Right, of course. So the main goal with the agents for text messaging is to reach all of the leads that they're getting in inbound or that they're getting into the lead forms as quickly as possible, as accurately as possible. And there's only so much that you can do over the phone with those leads, especially when the speed to response is needed to be as quickly as possible to capture those leads. The majority of the portals online that offer lead vending for insurance are either routing to multiple agents or someone that is running a search on the phone or on the web looking for health insurance might go to your site and then right after go to another site, a third, a fourth, a fifth. So the moment that someone is running a search, there is a race that has started for who will do the first response, how accurate that first response will be, and then how streamlined will the follow-up be to make sure that the contact is established and is maintained. So
The time is of essence.
Time is of the essence. Time is always of the essence. Exactly. And that's the main reason why the agents use our platform, to make sure that they can project their presence in a way that they couldn't have done over the phone before. With all the leads that were coming in, you could only dial, well, as many as one while you're on the phone. But with this, now you can text them as they're coming in, and with follow-ups throughout the day to make sure that you get that response of I'm interested, and then take it from there into the into quoting, into booking an appointment, into eventually getting a sale for the policy.
Wow. And if you were to hypothetically either take away this function or feature from your application, or it didn't work for a period of time, how impactful would that be to your customers?
Very, very impactful. Like, believe it or not, it's a CRM, but it functions as most of a, it functions more like a lifestyle app with how much our users are on it. Seeing how involved they are in sales, they actually spend in our app the amount of hours that they're in the company doing the sales throughout the day. So we have users that are logged on and don't stop being logged on from 8 a.m. all the way out until 10 p.m. So functionality when it comes to receiving calls, routing calls, receiving text and routing texts is very, very important. And it's the core process of what the app actually offers.
Wow. Anything else before we move into our next thing that you would like the audience to know about OnlySales? And more specifically, I'm sure that, you know, it's a competitive landscape on your end. I know you mentioned go high level. Why would someone that's in your industry, and sometimes we'll get prospects that are right for Telgorithm, but also many times right for our customers further down, why would someone potentially want to consider OnlySales versus what they're using today?
Right. Well, for that, I think it comes down to functionality. And for that, it really comes down to the niche that we've selected and how much we've gone into it. I worked in the sales process that all of our agents that use the platform work on now. So this is a platform built as a passion project from a previous agent running that exact same cycle, optimized to have all of the tools and systems that they specifically need and nothing else. I consider CRMs nowadays, and you'll see this online everywhere, a very Red Sea. It's kind of the terminology that they use. There's thousands and thousands, and you've got giant companies that have been around for like dozens of years now that just seem like projected onto the ceiling scape of this entire thing. You've got like Salesforce, for example, being around since the 90s. And yet there's still always space, because the bigger that a platform gets, the more generalist they try to be. And the more generalist they try to be, the harder they become for a specific use case. There's jokes going around online that you sometimes need an advanced degree to figure out what a CRM will actually do. Our platform is built to be the easiest thing to possibly be used for people that are running that sales cycle of private health insurance. And while we might eventually move away from that vertical once we have fully mastered it, right now is the one thing that we do, and it's the one thing that we do very well.
Awesome. Wow, that sounds amazing. Let's move forward a bit over here. So you just discussed how important it is for the users of your platform to have access and to be able to use text messages. I recall earlier you mentioned that you're currently leveraging a cloud communication API company for your text messages by the name of Telnex. Can you tell us, prior to Telgorithm, what had been your experience at Telnex? What was working, what was not working, and why that was important to you?
Sure, sure. I mean, when it comes to cloud-based providers, I think that even before Telnex, the first one that we found that we actually used was Twilio. And that's what we used while we were the high-level version white-labeled, because it's the only one that they had a connector for. And that's also the one that we considered originally when rebuilding the things ourselves. But the problem with Twilio was that as easy as they are to use and as much documentation as they have, the price is also very expensive, prohibitively expensive at times once you start to scale into an application which mostly does SMS. So we used Twilio originally, and then once we noticed that we had the opportunity to rebuild everything and that we could secure our own carrier and integrate them ourselves, we started looking online, and we selected Telnex as the option because it was both lower priced and we could actually sign a contract with them, which we did, for even
How
lower
long
than
ago
that.
was that, if you don't mind my asking?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
That was around like mid to late 2022 that we
got it.
signed the original contract with them. Yeah. Um,
Awesome.
yeah, and the advantage when switching from Twilio to Telnex was that the documentation was nearly about the same. So the route were a little bit different, but they were easy to ingest and add onto the app. And also the cost was a little bit easier as well too when it comes to like Twilio at scale versus Telnex at scale. And at the start, it was great. It was great because we had access to their engineers. We even had access to some of the like C-level suite that actually joined on a couple of the calls at the start, very early on in the process. And then it just kind of went from there. But the issue that we had with Telnex was that the experience that we had at the start was not the experience that continued over time. We thought at the start that the level of interest and attention that we were getting originally throughout the sales cycle would continue throughout. So it would be just as easy to integrate new features or get specialist support when it comes to things like eventually 10DLC would be. But the handoffs continued after the sale. For the first couple of months, we had direct access to engineering. We had direct access to a couple of people in the C-level suite until eventually we got transferred off to an account manager. And then that became the primary source of contact from that point onwards.
Right. And, one of the things that's interesting about this industry in particular is sometimes, I think many industries, you look for a great customer service, whatever, a kind of service you're purchasing, you want great customer service. But I think, and again, I want to hear from you, but it sounds like this, that especially in the world of, cloud communication APIs, whether they be voice or SMS APIs, particularly in A2P 10ELC, because these things are so specific, so niche and ever changing, you require from ideally your provider a team of people that will be there for you to be many times proactive on things, but surely even in cases where you have issues, that are experienced, knowledgeable to be able to help guide you and solve your issues versus, not having that help there and trying to either figure it out yourself and may not have the right answers. Would you say is just as important to you as the actual technology that you're integrating with itself?
I would say that specialized support is one of the most important things that a platform should offer. And it's a core process for what we do with our own users. The people that we have in the customer service departments have done health insurance sales in the past. So they understand both the sales process and our own technology on the back end as well, too. And that was the issue that we had with Telnex, was that at the start, there was a lot of that like high level interaction with people in their engineering staff or whatnot. And then once we got assigned to a account manager, that person did not have that deep level of experience when it comes to engineering, when it comes to the code base. So questions needed to run through a human filter almost, and then eventually get assigned to someone in the back end that it starts to misunderstand the question, then you just kind of go backwards and forwards from there. So like what I think is the issue is companies, once they start to scale, think that the best option might be to just set up tiers of customer service. But in setting up the tiers, they hire people that are specialists at customer service, not necessarily specialists at their actual stack or at the actual technology. And that's when it gets really complicated, especially when you have developers as your core audience. When we come in with a ticket that says like this amount of messages did not get delivered, it doesn't mean that we think this amount of messages did not get delivered. It means that we have an exact count, and the count keeps rising, and it is the true absolute source of truth. So like it turned into things where like we would submit something, and it's like, and you get the tech equivalent of like, are you sure your computer's on? So that it adds a lot more complexity and time into handling support requests. And that's where things started to get a little bit more, it started to add a little bit more friction onto the customer service process, which wasn't that much of a big deal at the start. Their documentation was strong enough that we could just figure out most things ourselves. And the system was reliable enough, handle enough errors that it didn't really become a problem. And it only really became a major problem once 10DLC started to become a major point of the cycle of sending messages, and their support system wasn't set up to explain how exactly that transfer should be done and whether or not we were doing it correctly.
Got it. And what is your, speaking of this, we keep talking about this acronym called A2P 10DLC. If you were to describe it to someone that's new, let's just say a company starting out, they need text messaging today for their users and are looking to explore using local phone numbers. But you need to do X, Y, and Z now with this thing called A2P 10DLC. Based on your current understanding, what would you actually say A2P 10DLC is?
Okay. So I'm a little bit older with the system of telemarketing. Like we were around when A2P 10DLC was not required, and even when it was barely an idea back in the day. So the way that I see it from the practical understanding is the telecom companies got around together and then decided, what can we do to reduce the amount of spam and the amount of messages that we're receiving, which shouldn't really be routed to the end users? Because text marketing or just texts in general is one of the oldest platforms for message delivery, along with emails. And while emails have decided to adding filters over time, and there's like major providers that handle that, for texts, that wasn't really the case. Something which was sent would immediately route to the end destination, no filtering provided originally. And that can be exploited, and it was in fact very much exploited by the platforms and things like all of those texts that we've received in the past, like your IRS thing is like getting into a problem, contact this or contact that, or like you're running into your car's extended warranty. Things like that would arrive over text, immediately blaring up into your screen. And what I'm guessing eventually happened with the telecom companies is they needed one single source of truth to make sure that the right messages were routed and the wrong messages were not. And for that meant that there needed to be a central organization system where things are registered and where things are verified. But you've got different telecom companies with different sub-telecom companies on top of that, a structure of hundreds and hundreds of things that has been around for at least 100 years. How do you organize that entire thing? So like they announced that 10DLC would eventually become a thing, and they announced that as early as like 2019 or 2020. And it was only until like 2022, the end of it, that it started really becoming a forced on feature. And it started by just raising the costs of unregistered messaging because it couldn't actually enforce the rule that it should be registered. So nowadays you have to register through the campaign registry your brand, the brand of the end user that's going to be receiving the messages and sending the messages, with information about their brand or company, sample messages about their brand of company, and the level of outbound throughput that they require as well too. And then once they are properly approved on that, then they can send messages which are now signed with the brand ID and with the campaign ID. And in this way, they get to make sure that the messages which are arriving are registered and are supposed to be arriving and are not just unsigned packages coming in from other countries or from spam networks.
Awesome. I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself. There is one nuance that I like to add to this that many times is missed. And it's not on you that might have been missed, because the industry at large many times is very shaky on what it actually is. But you've been well immersed in it. And so you're near expert in this, but I'll add an additional layer to this. And that is, we say there's so many acronyms in this industry, but this is called A to P. And to your point, it was launched, the first one to launch their A to P path was actually Verizon Wireless back in February of 2020. But what existed prior to A to P? P to P, or person to person. And so one of the things that's missed, but it's important to understand this, and I'll get to why in a second, and how it will lead to some experience on 10DLC, is because when texting protocol, as you mentioned, which is Dinosaur World, was created by the mobile network operators back in the 90s, there was no Twilio, there was no Telnex, there was no cloud communication like you have it today. The use case back then was, you might have had a StarTAC flip phone or some LG phone where you could overcharge it back and they with a little camera. And the point back then, and the use case back then is I don't want to get on the phone personally, privately, with my mom or with my friend. And so therefore creating a technology and a function on a cell phone, which everyone used for voice, by having to type out messages back and forth would be convenient. And so that was the use case when the SMPP protocol was initially created, was called person to person, meaning the whole idea of that protocol had nothing to do with a business to business or a business to consumer communication, because that use case for how it's being used today simply didn't exist back then, where we stood in our the evolution of technology. And the reason I bring this up and why this is important is because if you think about it, if I was to send you a text message by hand and we're conversing back and forth using a cell phone by hand, when I think about throughputs, I don't know about you, Andre, but 60 messages in 1 minute to type out by finger, that's quite a lot. I don't know if anyone could actually do that. And even if you could, I doubt we could converse in that format. And hence, as you know, historically, on messaging, that was the limit, 60 messages per minute. Because again, the use case was meant for a private person communicating by physical hand with another private person. Now, where this started to get interesting is with the advent of technology and the internet and everything in the infrastructures behind telecommunications became cloud-based. And then you have companies, Twilio being one of the first, but not by far not the only one, tapping into these virtual channels so that you could build these into your applications for business purposes. What a brilliant idea. Everyone answers a text. I don't have to get on a phone. I don't have any special app I need to install. And sure enough, they were able to tap into this protocol. But again, the use case that this protocol was initially created for had nothing to do and was not ever intended for a business to business or business to consumer communication. And this started to set up a number of issues. Number one is that even in your use cases, and we can get to that, but even if you think more broadly, if you're running a Black Friday sale and you have millions of users, well, 60 messages in 1 minute over a number simply ain't going to work. Or even something even more critical than that. What about an electric or utility company that has millions of users and there's a power outage and they need to inform them by text to, when that outage will be over or what the status is? Well, I'm sorry, 60 messages in a minute per number is not going to work. And so what ended up happening is businesses said, wait, 60 messages in a minute per number. Well, I'm just going to get 10 numbers. I'm going to get 20 numbers. I'm going to get 100,000 numbers and start blasting it out. Again, not the intent of the person-to-person protocol and why it was created for. And this started to turn into a little bit of a technical war between the mobile network operators and then the cloud communication providers that were making tremendous money on this, obviously, and back and forth. And this technical war started out with filtering. So I would filter this message, filter that message. Then I noticed that every 3 messages I get filtered. So I'm going to start a number rotation and start rotating numbers for every other message. Then I noticed that this word worked, that URL doesn't work, this one comes in, and back and forth until ultimately the mobile network operators started introducing AI into this. And then so did the other ones started introducing AI or some automation into that. And about 6 years ago, after multiple class action lawsuits by end users, particularly in T-Mobile's case, the mobile network operator said enough is enough. 2 things they realized. One, the protocol we created back in the 90s for person-to-person communication is not proper for this new use case of business-to-business or business-to-consumer communication. It's simply not proper, primarily from a throughput standpoint. The throughput and byway we created simply was never intended for that. So we need to create a new protocol for this because there are legitimate businesses that their end users want to legitimately be able to communicate with them, and business to business as well. So we need to create a new byway for this, primarily reason being we need to support the higher throughput for those use cases. Because one of the things I like to mention that people miss many times is if it was just about compliance, why didn't they just make you have to register on P2P, the old sanctioned path? What's with this A to P? Right? And so the point number 1 being they needed to create a new protocol to support these use cases of business to consumer communication. But then also secondarily, they also realized, wait a second, if we make this much easier that you could send literally thousands of messages per minute or whatever you're needing on a given number without having to go through all this hoops and stuff, what is to stop all the nefarious activity that's festered over the years on the original legacy protocol, which was meant for P2P, which is simply just going over to the A to P. Oh, this is a lot easier. Why would I procure hundreds of thousands of numbers and do all this stuff? I'm just going to go straight here. And so in order to combat and prevent that, because obviously they wanted to give higher throughputs for better deliverability, to create a clean ecosystem, they needed to partner with a vendor. And this vendor actually is a company called Calera, which is a cloud communication company based out of Italy. They were recently acquired by a company called Tata Communications, but essentially they were chosen by the mobile network operators to be kind of the reputation authority to manage all the players in this ecosystem. And they created a subsidiary organization, which you just alluded to, called the Campaign Registry. And the idea would be is that every single entity in this ecosystem, whether it be a brand, whether it be a connectivity partner, whether it be a reseller, which I want to talk about, a CSP, whether it be a DCA, everyone kind of has to enter this ecosystem, like you mentioned, alluded to a little bit earlier, where there's brand IDs and campaign IDs and CSP IDs. So everything is tracked and managed properly so that they can keep a clean ecosystem. So the way that I actually put it is, yes, there are things that are being reinforced. There are certain compliance things that are new, but actually, if you really look at it, most compliance rules actually exist on P2P. They were always there, they just were not enforced. Now they're being enforced, and many people never even heard of them. And I think there's all these new rules. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some new rules, but most of them fundamentally have always existed on person to person, but are just now being enforced to keep a clean ecosystem to give you ultimately what? So not only better deliverability, but more fundamentally, higher throughput capabilities is the key. For instance, as we'll get into, low volume campaign versus dedicated campaign or external vetting. It's all about throughputs, not about compliance. It's about compliance as the entryway ticket to get into the ecosystem. But actually what you're paying for is the throughputs to be able to communicate business to business or business to consumer, and why registration is now so important. Because to your point, it first started out with hiking pass-through fees, but also concurrently, the filtering, even more filtering on that P2P path, ultimately to a point where last August, as you know, Twilio did a cutoff on their end for all unregistered traffic. And this December 1st, Cineverse, who's actually Twilio's aggregator, is the final DCA that has announced that as of December 1st, they will not forget about hiking carrier pass-through fees. No more. There is no more unregistered traffic. You must be completely registered. And so clearly, if you're going to use local phone numbers, which has many benefits to it, and your customers of your application rely on that, you need to make sure you know what it even means to register. How should I go about registering? Who should I register with? What type of connectivity partner should I use that is going to properly not only be educated, but also have technology to be able to support you properly while you're using this? And all those things are important here. And so one of the things I want to get started with, besides we'll get to the pain points you had on Telnex, but I already know this from a prior conversation with you, and I want to get to that as well. When you showed up with Telgorithm, one of the questions that we asked you was, were you a CSP? Now, many times we get prospects in pipe and like, well, were we a what? A CSP, a campaign service provider, or they say, oh yes, I'm a CSP, sure, I'm registered. Not knowing the difference of when they give the tax IDs to their current provider, who's really only supposed to be their connectivity partner, that really they're not a CSP at all. And I was hoping if you could share with our audience today, because if I recall correctly, you were already a CSP, how you came about becoming a CSP. Many vendors like Twilio don't support that by default. I believe Telnex does. I don't know if it's promoted as much, but can you explain to the audience from your understanding, because it's important, what is CSP is versus, we'll call it the reseller model?
Gotcha. So from my understanding, and it's limited to just the practical side from my end.
Totally.
It's at the start, we didn't even know. Like, we didn't know like which was the difference in between one and the other. And when we started to notice that, like, you know, the things that we noticed, which is the hike in the unregistered fees, we decided, well, okay, we clearly need to register. So now the question is, well, how exactly do we register, and what is registration even about? So then we start to get the very basics of what it's supposed to be. Send some information about the brand, their registration, their EIN, and their website, their sample messages, and then just send it to who do we send it to? We have no idea. So that's when we reach out to the Telnex support channel, and then we asked to our account manager, what exactly is it supposed to be? And that took a little while to get an answer. And then we get this answer that we have to send it over to them, and then they will take care of the rest. We send the information on the brand and the details, and then they will take it from there. And that was the fastest way to take care of this entire process. And that is all we knew. We didn't know the difference in between one and the other. And it's only until later that we realized, and that we found out after speaking with you guys, that
and one second, just to be clear for our audience, so part of registering requires this process called a brand, which is an entity, or would be one of your customers or one of our customers, where the campaign registry requires the EIN number or the tax ID, along with the legal business name that's on file with the government entity. And so I'm just curious, because many times we've gotten this in the past, was that something within your industry that you were easily able to obtain from your customer base? I'm just curious.
Right. So for our industry, it was mostly already easy to find. The users that we have, they're their own sales organizations, and they already have established companies for their own commissions most of the time. They're usually 1099. So they already had the process for that. We just didn't know what to do with it once we had it. Exactly.
And then once Telnex started saying, hey, give us this information, was that alarming to you or your team in any way? Wait, why am I sharing my customers' tax IDs and addresses with my provider? I don't know. Maybe it didn't ring a bell for you. I'm just curious.
Yeah. So for my side, it wasn't really that a concern in terms of like security, although maybe it should have been. What the concern was on my side was that after doing that with a test batch, we weren't really getting movement. We weren't knowing, like, we weren't getting told, okay, this application is in process, or what's actually happening, or what's going on. And it took like weeks, and then weeks on weeks. And then like 3 or 4 weeks later, we would have to reach out and then ask about it. And then just then we would get the explanation on what happened. And at that point, we started to get told that their system was manual. and that we would send something to them, and then they would aggregate it and send it down the line somewhere else. And this is when they started adding random keywords like downstream and this and that, DCA or MNO, but like, again, from the perspective of someone which is handling customer service, which is not involved in that part. So like, we were getting told a very non-specific implementation of how this is supposed to work. But even in that explanation, it wasn't working like that. So we tried to get access to the engineers that were in charge of this like process and how exactly it works, so that if it is going to take 3 weeks, because that's what we thought was just the default, then how can we do it so that when we register, once those 3 weeks are done, then it's done and it's fine, and it doesn't require an update or some sort of appeal, which might take another 3 to 4 to 5 weeks until it's actually processed. And we weren't really getting that part, and that was the frustration that got us to speak originally.
Got it. And so how did you get to, so again, it started out, you were giving your EINs of your customer and their legal names directly to Telnex. How did you come about to the idea of going directly to the campaign registry and realizing that there's another way to go about this where you have more visibility? And I want you to talk a little bit about that if you can. Going to the registry itself and figuring out, getting your own campaign service provider account, as they call it, and then finding out that Telnex will support that, they won't support that. How did you kind of find out that path even exists altogether?
We found that out when we after a certain amount of time there, we realized that like, we're not getting movement, things are not getting approved, that whatever we're getting back, we have to ask ourselves. So we're not getting a hook or a response when something is happening. We just have to ask someone, an actual person. There was no API for this back then, as to what is going on with this brand, and then get a person answer about it, which would take it would add way more latency onto a process which is supposed to be automatic. And and when we spoke originally, then we got the understanding that like, what they were offering us is a reseller brand, where like, we're registering onto Telnex, and then Telnex is taking the registration from that point and adding it onto themselves through a platform which already has an API and already has ways to like, understand what is going on with the registrations. So like, once we understood that concept, which it took us like talking to get it, and we weren't able to get it before, then we realized, wait, so we can handle our own registrations, and we can know at the time that the registrations are handled what exactly happened. They were approved, they were denied, and if they are approved, we know that instantly from the source of truth that that they're approved, and we don't have to wait for them to aggregate it and then them to pass it to a customer service agent, and then that customer service agent to notify us so we can notify our users. So it cut down a lot in that middle part. And then we registered with the campaign registry as a CSP, as a campaign service provider, I believe, ourselves. And then we started registering our users under our own brand.
Right, under your own setup through the TCR. But was it Telnex that ultimately told you about that, or you did some kind of external research somewhere? Like, how did you actually find out you could even do that?
Yeah, so what we were told originally, and that's part of my frustration with like the way that we had communication set up on there, was that like, the best option to handle registrations was to hand it over to Telnex to do. And while there was an option to do it yourself, it's just complicated, and it just takes a little bit longer.
They made clear that there was some other path that you could potentially take to accomplish a similar thing, but that it was much more complicated to do that, and therefore don't even look into that and just give us all of your customers' information.
Right, and it wasn't really explained that in detail, because I don't know if the person that was in charge of explaining it to us had that detail at hand or understood it fully. So like, we got like a broken telephone chain of the information, like 4 chains removed. So like the information that we got wasn't really that specific, and it took us days to get it. So when we understand that things are about speed, like our entire platform is built on speed for our users, and the way in which we develop is built on iterating as quickly as possible, with updates happening like daily even. So once we saw what we saw, which to us was, you give it to us, we do it. There's another way, but it was barely even explained. So I'm like, okay, so we give it to you and we do it. Cool. So added that as a system, sent a batch was taken forever. And in the meantime, the fees were increasing more and more, and we were gearing up towards open enrollment. Open enrollment is this like period of the year in which agents like concentrate the majority of their business because it's the open buying season for insurance policies. So
we deal with that
traffic,
ourselves with our own company.
Yeah, so our traffic increases around that time, leading up to it and during it, and that's around the time that we were having this issue. And it's like our traffic was increasing, we were having more users sign on, and then we had a dual error or dual problem. The registrations weren't getting processed, and also the filtering, which we spoke about a little earlier, was getting harsher and harsher and harsher, to the point where someone with an actual verifiable use case that is registered, that has licenses in like 20 different states, would have their delivery rate for like lists which do not contain landlines or anything like that. So like the only error is filtered or not filtered, basically. They would have their delivery rate start at like 80% or 85%, and then over like a week drop all the way to like 35 to 45%. So the delivery rate dropped harsher and harsher, and the costs for us to send those messages rise like higher and higher. And at that point we couldn't wait anymore. We couldn't just sit there and take that the answer that we were getting was the right answer, and it wasn't even moving in the first place. So we started speaking, and once we started speaking, we realized like we have to do it this way. And like we didn't even accept that as truth. We just tested it. But once we tested it and saw that it worked, then we started moving everything over. And the crazy thing is that,
just to be clear to our audience, you mean that once you went to this, you saw this other option that they were highly not recommending. They're saying easier, just give it to easier, being the key word here. To just give it to us and we'll take care of it for you. But then, which wasn't working, you didn't have the visibility on that, and you weren't getting things to where they needed to be. You then knew of this other option, but they just weren't promoting it. So then led you down this path to explore it. And once you started integrating with the campaign registry itself, signed up to register as a CSP and started integrating with them and therefore you noticed that this was a way much more visible, but also a much more streamlined and better process compared to what they said was supposedly easier with just giving the EIN to them. Is that a fair statement?
Exactly. And it's so true, in fact, that the batch that we send to get approved through the registry directly as part of our CSP registration was approved faster, and it was larger than the batch that we had sent to them, which by then had been in process for about 65 days to 70 days. So to us, what that meant was you do it this way and you get registrations approved faster than the older way, in which they're still in process right now. So that meant switch as quickly as possible.
Totally. So I want to bring up three things here in this regard, and thanks for clarifying this. Number one, we've been advocates. So first of all, as you know, Telgorithm from day one only supports CSPs because we have been very clear and we have a close relationship with the campaign registry on exactly what registration is, how it should work, and that a campaign service provider, which is clearly laid out on the campaign registry site, what that actually is actually not a nicety. It is required, mandatory that you go directly to the campaign registry itself, as what Tulio dubs it, an ISV must go there. I mean, simply put, the word reseller, which is when you give your EIN to your connectivity partner and they also operate as a CSP, is reseller. Well, it doesn't sound to me, based on what you described, OnlySales is that you're in the cloud communication industry reselling Telnix APIs. You're not a reseller. You're a campaign service provider. Your application provides messaging campaigns for the insurance industry. And so you need to be going directly to there, number one. Number two, we actually hosted twice the vice president of the campaign registry to discuss this exact subject, clarified with him that this is not only correct, but also, and which you just highlighted here, that it is completely false and untrue. I want to hear from you, that the same amount of steps is required either way. It's just that some steps are done in TCR and some steps are then done with your provider, but in totality, it's actually the same amount of steps there. So this whole idea of that it's easier to do it here is actually factually untrue. In addition to that, and you talked about the visibility which you get, because you're creating your own brands, you're creating your own campaigns, you're doing your vettings. There's another important piece here, which I'm sure you're aware of now, and that is ownership, right? So when you realize, oh, this is actually working, I need to take all my prior campaigns and brands that were under Telnix's CSP account, even they should have just been CNP. You know how would if you wanted to migrate them to your own ownership setup, you'd have to re-register that all over again, brands and campaigns and so on and so forth. So there's no visibility, there's no ownership to your brands and campaigns. You have nothing essentially there. So to me, and again, I want to hear from you because you're the actual end user here. Is it safe to say that there is no value at all? And maybe there is, but surely the values or pros of going directly to the TCR as a CSP from your standpoint certainly outweighs any potential hypothetical positives of saying, hey, just give your connectivity partner, your cloud communication provider, your customers' EIN and business names.
Yeah. So for that, what I would say is that like the way that we see software nowadays is that things are just abstractions on implementation, which are just abstractions on like deeper layer implementation, and on it goes. So using a reseller or like just going to the carrier and then asking them to do it for you is easier in the sense that you don't have to build your own middle layer implementation for touching the campaign registry and then getting the response back, which might make sense for very small scale applications in which like SMS is like a 0.01% of their stack. They're just sending a notification once a day about like the aggregated whatever happened on that day. But for us is the entirety of our platform. And for that, we don't need a magic middle layer which just does something with no explanation. We need like down to the metal explanation for what exactly happens and how quickly it's happening so we can iterate faster. And for that, the reseller model doesn't really work. And going directly to the campaign registry is the easiest way possible. And not only that, but like there might be this understanding online that the campaign registry is difficult to work with, like their APIs and their webhooks for like sending in registrations and for getting updates as registrations are handling are done in a very easy to understand and implement way. So we didn't really need this magic middle layer in the middle. And by doing it ourselves, we had direct control of it. We had direct control of when we're sending appeals, and we had direct understanding of when things are getting approved so we can immediately use them. Which for our use case, what it really meant was that we didn't have to spend so much in unregistered fees for users which already had a registration, but we just couldn't process it. So like we were sitting on all of our users fully documented with all of the things that they need to get approved, but we just couldn't get them approved because we were getting like told that this is the way to go. Like we counted the amount of money that we were spending on unregistered fees per day that we didn't need to spend because they were already like they had registrations, we just couldn't process them, and it averaged out to like $4,500 to $5,000 per day that we were spending on fees that didn't need to exist. Which meant like we needed like an answer right away, and getting an answer from the customer support rep took like 2 to 3 days. And when we got the answer, it wasn't a specific answer. So we needed to ask a follow-up question, which would take a couple days more, maybe try to schedule something with engineering, which might take a couple days to check their schedule, and then a couple days to actually get it. And every single day, $5,000 goes away. Like, it started to stack heavily throughout that like 60 days that we were waiting for approvals of the first batch and still not getting the entirety of those approved, or knowing exactly like why they got approved or why didn't they.
Right. Knowing why is important, because I always break this out into two things. One is processing times, regardless of approval or rejection. It's the time it actually takes to process it. And then there's the approval rejection piece. And many people I'm sure many know this already, but every time you submit a campaign upstream, it's actually manually reviewed by DCA. And typically there's a charge of $10 to $15 per vet. So if it gets rejected and you have to refix it and resubmit it, that's another cost on top of the loss of money that you're getting, because your customer either has to send unregistered traffic for higher fees or can't send traffic altogether, which is a delay in revenue from that side there. I'll even add one other point to what you mentioned is not only by going to TCR, you get access. By going to your connectivity partner, let's just say in your case was Telnex, they still have to go to the TCR. They don't have the ability, they don't create campaign IDs on their end. They're just relabeling or going into the portal on their end to do that. So you're adding a middle layer regardless of that. In other words, if the campaign registry was delayed, and then you tack on someone else that has to do it for you, you're going to deal with the delay, no matter how short it is, of that vendor. And then on top of that, going there versus going directly to itself. Because at the end of the day, the TCR is the only entity where you can actually create a brand or a campaign itself. And many times folks don't realize that's where it's created. That's where you get the visibility, and that the approvals take place upstream at DCA, at the aggregator that they are using, which is important to have a provider that will give you guidance on proactively, because once you get rejected and you have another fee, on how to understanding you, your software, your customer base, and your industry, and knowing what the requirements are from the actual team at the DCA that reviews your campaigns, proactively ensuring to understand that once you lob it over the fence, not only will it be processed in a timely way, but also that it will likely get approved. So before we move on to, and I know we're running up on a little bit of time, so we appreciate your time here, but what was the kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back on the Telnex side that said, look, even after you integrated as a CSP with the TCR, and luckily they were able to support that, many vendors today still don't even fully support that, or you have to go through some approvals to get that done. So I'm glad that they were able to do that. But what was the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back where you realize this is just not working? We have to look for another provider, which no one wants to do, right? It's a pain in the neck, however you look at it. But what was that thing that you would say, hey, we need to look somewhere else?
Well, for us, it was the fact that we had counted the total amount that we were losing, and it was 5,000 per day, which meant that it was like, what is that, like 30,000 or so per week? So it was a cost that we were spending. So like you can only take so many weeks of that before you start to think, all right, there's got to be something else we can do. And I think that we waited an appropriate amount of time. It was like 60 days from the time that we originally submitted stuff. So multiply that by 5,000 a day, and you get the count of how much we spent just waiting for an answer. And it's not just that, but also as that was happening, the delivery rate was dropping. So what does that mean for our users? Well, that means that they were spending the same amount that they were spending before, but now their money goes 20% less than they went before. And we know that they can register to get it better, but we can't facilitate the registration for them. And then also, once we did finally start getting approvals and rejections weeks and weeks after they were submitted, and we had to manually ask for those, then the answer was just a Boolean, this one was approved, this one was denied. And then the question would be like, well, why was this one approved and why was this one denied? Well, now we know that the campaign registry actually sends like notifications detailing exactly from even the person that did the approval or denial, what their notes are on why they were denied. But like we weren't getting that ourselves, so we had to just do like guesses. And it's like, why is it that certain things are getting denied, so that we could do it better, so that we could submit one-off things that never get like reviewed unnecessarily? And we weren't getting that either. So drop in delivery meant drop in effectiveness for our user spend. Lack of registration visibility meant that we didn't really understand how to get out of that cycle. And then lack in speed of responses and access to like the true source of knowledge, engineering or whatnot, or people that were in charge of talking to the registry from there, and meant that we didn't understand anything of anything. The only thing that we understood was that every day that we didn't understand costed us $5,000.
Thank you for sharing that. It's so important. So what led you towards, and we could switch over to the next slide here. What led you to, first of all, how did you find Telgorithm, and what was it initially that intrigued you about Telgorithm? I'm sure that you've done your due diligence. I know that you had initially came from Twilio, so I'm assuming they were not back on the table again after that experience. You're probably feeling frustrated. shit, I went from Twilio to Telnex,
Mhm.
and now I'm dealing with this again here.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming, that in and of itself was frustrating. So
Mhm.
walk us through that a little bit. What you were thinking, once you hit this breaking point, how you were looking at potentially, hey, I need a new vendor, how you went about that
Mhm.
process, and ultimately how you found, or what attracted you to Telgorithm.
Yeah. Yeah. We didn't even consider Twilio because like we know what's happening with other CRMs in the industry. We speak to our users, they use other stuff. We know the owners of certain other platforms as well too. And like what we knew is for however much Telnex was taken, Twilio was taken even more in getting approvals done, because they had cut off and they had decided that approvals are just like they're going to happen now. And that was before they were actually enforced, but that meant that they created a giant backlog inside of their own system. So if we're setting up the middleware of like, this is their platform, and then this is the TCR, Twilio's backlog was like gigantic, and then the TCR was on the other end too. So we knew we couldn't touch Twilio, and we knew that Telnex wasn't quite it. We took a look at other platforms. We took a look at Bandwidth first originally, but there wasn't even a way to like talk to them unless you'd set up like layers and layers of like meetings until you actually got in charge to speak to someone. So like we looked around online, and then we saw you guys, and then we saw the interviews with the campaign registry people, the explanation on like how exactly it all works out. And I think that at that time the banner at the top was just like get registrations actually approved or something along the layers of that. So we spoke with sales, I believe it
I
was
remember, I'm
Josh at
just
sales.
curious because
Yeah.
obviously this is a competitive industry, meaning the industry that Telgorithm is in, and we try to be transparent about things. But, unfortunately in this industry, and we're trying to change that, is make things more transparent. So many people dub a lot of different things. Many times, hey, get your campaigns approved in 30 seconds, which we all know was never true.
Right.
How did you, even though you saw, so what attracted you was our marketing, and thanks Samantha and team for that, but what attracted you was the fact that we were saying we can get things approved in a faster way. And in addition, you saw some of the content that we put out with the actual leadership of the TCR. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And so in the process, when you started to engage with Telgorithm, how did you find that initial process, along with the fact that I'm assuming you came with a bit of skepticism? Hey, they said that they could do X, Y, and Z. I'm not saying they can't, but how am I going to know that? Walk us through, if you recall, how you went about that process from your perspective.
Sure. So we originally spoke with Josh in sales, and we got an understanding of like what our platform does and what we need and what this platform provides to a middle extent. Josh is very knowledgeable, but after that we got a call with you directly, and then that was it. Like on the first like 10 minutes of that, we got all of the answers to all of the questions that we had been looking for the last like 2 months. So if I had to put a price on that consulting call, almost, it would be 5,000 a day times the 60 days that it took us. That's how much that call itself was worth. And it lasted about 15 minutes. And in those 15 minutes, we understood like everything that there was that we had been doing wrong and how it could be done better. And like and once we got that idea, then we just submitted the CSP registration, and then we just submitted a test batch. And when we saw that test batch got approved very quickly, and for the ones that didn't, we understood why, then everything just started rolling from there.
In other words, in the way, from your standpoint, in the way Telgorithm is set up with the requirement of being a CSP of the TC, which you already were, we had nowhere to hide. In other words, Aaron, as much as I know, or anyone on my team could tell you X, Y, and Z, we had no way to hide, because if we couldn't get your campaigns DCA approved, you would have literally seen that agnostically within your own TCR account. Or if we got something rejected and we didn't say the right things or provided the right guidance, you would have seen that, meaning Telgorithm has nowhere to hide. So it would do us no good almost to say, we could do X, Y, and Z, but we can't, because the way you could easily test that just by nature of our setup, you're going to find that out very quickly and with almost no cost at all, where it wouldn't even pay for Telgorithm to say something we couldn't do, because you would realize that very, very quickly. Would you say that based on your experience with the initial part of engaging Telgorithm is true?
Yeah, for sure. And like, again, we came in with skepticism and we didn't really trust anything, but like once we started to see it and once it started to work, it made sense in a lot of ways. And it was twofold, the advantage that we received from switching over. Not only was it that the approvals could be done quickly, but that we could also tell our users how those approvals actually work so that we can make sure that it's one-off approvals, not approval and appeal. And also that the delivery rate increased because now it's not going through the layers and layers of filtering that was implemented, and it's using this 10 DLC approval path instead. So what that meant for us was, 150,000 in savings in the cost that we were spending on the fees, but also the delivery rate raised from like 40 to 50 all the way up to like 95 to 97%. So that was already a heavy increase. And not only that, but now we understood the process of registration, which meant that we could explain the process of registration as it pertains to the health insurance industry. So we did that to our users.
Yes.
And
No,
that
ahead.
we integrated Telgorithm into our core offering. Not only can we now allow you to have higher delivery of your messages, but we can also help you with registering for higher throughput if it is needed for your agent or your office. But also we understand exactly how approvals are being done. We know at the second that they're approved or they're denied, why exactly that is. And then once everything is in place, we can send the messages and get them delivered more than before. So
awesome.
yeah.
One other thing, and thank you for sharing all this. It's all super important. I'm glad that we were able to handle that for you in your particular industry. And I want to point this out because we do get prospects that are in a similar state, could be in various industries, where in your setup today, you do this thing called templating. So just to take a step back for a second, the campaign registry, when you create a brand within the campaign registry, requires that you add a website under that brand. That is a requirement today. And obviously they go to that website and look at the website, and there's certain requirements that are needed on that website, including a privacy policy with certain specific languages. If I recall, when we were setting you up, you had some challenges in this area, what to put on the site, things were changing, and you didn't get a lot of lack of clarity there. Many times, many companies either can't get their brand itself that has their own website to make a change for various reasons. I'm curious if you could talk just a few minutes about, or a minute or two on that subject, because that comes up quite often in many industries, on how you've dealt with that and how you've dealt with that in particular case in working with Telgorithm.
Yeah, of course. Once we understood the way in which our users should be registered, then we started to take a look into how we can enforce the parameters within their site. They were coming in with different websites of different providers, different locations. We didn't have a way in which we could edit those. We had seen from other CRMs in our space that they were running things where they had like one aggregated site, and inside of that site, they had sublinks for every agent with just a form and like a privacy policy and nothing else. But the problem was that those didn't get approved in quite the same speed. And like while we tried it, it wasn't really as effective. So what we set up in ourselves is a pipeline or a method along with a web provider company, a whole system for making sure that our users have websites which are correctly edited to the level that they need to be in order to be approved. And once we have those, and we modify their existing sites, or we create one based on their existing site and then set them up with the platform. So we basically took the whole concept of registration, which for us, it was difficult to understand. For end users, it was impossible to understand. And we made it a matter of the onboarding process, which takes about 10 minutes with our app.
Awesome. And Telgorithm was able to help you facilitate that, to streamline that. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Awesome. One other thing, and I know we're running up on time, so again, we appreciate the extended overtime here. You know, we many times get, and I'm sure you've been in this position, it sounds like twice already, because you went from Twilio to Telnex and then Telnex to Telgorithm. So just before we get to this part, and I know we already touched on this, but migrating, I got to migrate numbers, all this complexity with integrating with a new vendor, all this other stuff, disruptions, all this other stuff. Walk us through, you know, if you can, just to our audience, was that, obviously that concern was there, but at the end of the day, after it was all said and done, would you say that it's worth it to stay with a provider? I'm not saying it's Telnex or anyone, where you're literally losing thousands of dollars a day versus maybe having a stigma around, hey, if I switch providers, this is going to be a total shit show that's even worse. And therefore the migration is so complicated, forget about it. And we'll just, you know, it is what it is. We'll deal with it. What would you say to a prospect that's kind of in that point right now where the pain is really there,
Mhm.
but they're kind of like, migrating providers sounds like a nightmare. And it's all this R&D work. Sometimes you get people come in, they think it's going to be $500,000 of R&D work. When I'm like, no, it's just a simple API. You already have what I like to say is you already have the plug built. You're just switching the outlet.
Yeah.
If you could talk a little bit about that, because that is something that comes up quite often.
Yeah. So for that, I'd say that like at times it is worth it to delete where you're at and go from scratch if the new version makes more sense. And like what we see with companies, and it's not just with like telecom, it's usually like databases or
Right.
stack, or like the way in which databases are queried, engines, whatever. Like they get into the slug. Like after it's been like a year or 2 years of a specific code base, it's like, oh, we can't change it anymore. We can just like make whatever incremental gains we can with the platform that we have. And something that we've noticed is that's the major problem with like technology nowadays. It's like they build on something which was available at the time, and then later just chase incremental gains. That I refer it out to Henry Ford's explanation when he was talking about like creating the car, and it's like if I asked people what they wanted, they would just want faster horses. So like after a while, companies are just stuck on this like making faster horses scenario. So like
Totally.
while someone might think like, well, if I switch this and that and modify this and this, then I could like have slightly better performance out of the telecom network that I'm connected with. What I would say is that like sometimes it makes sense to switch. I don't know when that cutoff is for you, but for us, it was at 5,000 a day spread over 60 days. While also losing money from our users because we were having delivery drops, and also that 5,000 a day was just what we were losing on the fees. That
Right.
doesn't count what we were offering in proactive refunds to users to make up for the difference in delivery.
And
So
also
really,
the
it was more like
experience
8
on
to
that.
10,000. Yeah, exactly. So like at some point, that cost makes sense to rebuild things, and for us, like we reached that. And also, it wasn't as difficult as
So
we
that's what I wanted to
originally
hear.
thought to make
How
that
long did
transfer.
it take for you to integrate, start to finish, would you say, against Telgorithm, in your case?
About 2 to 3 weeks.
Not 10 months, not 30 years, not whatever. I just want to be clear here. It took 2 to 3 weeks, and that was with full QA and everything that you needed to be comfortable to begin sending traffic and setup.
Exactly.
Awesome. And then as far as migration goes, I know we migrated your numbers. We offer hosted text messaging. Did you find that there were massive disruptions in that process at the time?
No disruptions at all.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that detail. And obviously, we're so proud to be able to continue to work with a company like OnlySales, and this is only just the beginning. And so glad that we could help you save in all of these areas. One last point I do want to bring, because it is unique to Telgorithm, is our queuing setup and why we have it and how complex it is. Many times. So first of all, as I mentioned earlier, and I'll do this briefly because I know we're really up on timers. Again, super appreciated. But as I mentioned before, A to P 10 DLC is about throughputs, right? Low volume versus dedicated versus external vetting to get a higher risk score on a higher throughput. But what many people don't realize, because they're so caught up in the registration of things, is that there is at the brand level, for instance, in T-Mobile's case, there's a 2,000 message daily limit. It's a starting point. AT&T has a certain per minute per campaign. Verizon is per number. And many people don't even realize that this is not being tracked by anyone. So get this, you're paying literally money for throughputs that no one is managing. You're not your connectivity partner, not the DCA. I mean, I'm sure you've been experienced this. If you send 2001 messages, boom, you're going to have a failed message. You go through all this effort, all this migration, all this setup only to get that there. And Telgorithm has a smart queuing system, which is extremely complex to build, as you know yourself.
Yeah.
This is really complex. Oh, we're just going to build it ourselves, or we don't care so much about that because we're only conversational messages. So we're never going to hit a limit at all. If you could talk a little bit about throughputs and why that's important, and it's important to have a partner that is managing that for you as being crucial to the partner you're going to choose. Why is that important?
Yeah, I would say that's extremely important, and that's also a part of what makes the migration so easy. because like as you start to scale into the A2P system, then you also need to manage, like you said, the speed at which you're sending out messages and the totals of messages that you're sending per day per brand for T-Mobile, for example. And then that can vary depending on which like approval score it's getting from like the vetting level. And that can vary live from the moment that you get that vetting revetted. Which means that like to get it set up on your side, you almost need to build an entire queuing engine to handle messages which are coming in and then route it on. And that engine should depend per number, per brand, per campaign to whichever endpoint is going to whichever carrier. And there's hundreds of different subcarriers managed by like a few dozen major carriers on top of that.
Right.
So to build that is insanely complex. And to be honest, we still
Can you
haven't
repeat that
even
again? I'm
tried.
sorry. To build that is what?
Insanely complex. Like we have our own queuing engines and systems for managing things like sending a message and then sending another and then kind of rate limiting and whatnot. But like to imagine the complexity at which this must take is like, it's insanely gigantic.
And your engineering team, from everything we've heard today, to me, sounds highly technical. Again, we hear from prospects, oh, we're just going to build it ourselves. We're going to figure this out, and not realizing it sounds like you've already understood this.
Yeah.
How complex it is. It's not only complex and different per network operator with all its subsidiaries, but it's also changing all the time. It's at the brand level, it's at the campaign level, and to be able to do this in real time on the fly, I could tell you we have a pending patent on it, but just for our audience to hear from a customer itself who's highly technical in this space, and this space matters, that this is not just something, hey, I'm just going to throw it together. So number one, it's crucial in A2P 10DLC.
Yeah.
And two, no, it's not going to be that you're just going to take a few days and build this queuing system, because the way queuing actually works, or the way throughputs work, is highly complex within the world of A2P 10DLC. Would you say that that's correct?
Yeah, no, I would say that's definitely correct. And the penalties for going above that throughput are also very high, depending on the network, sometimes as high as $10,000 per message. So like, do we really want to build that ourselves? Or suspensions, exactly. And a suspension at the registration level, at the CSP level, would mean that you lose access to network for all of your agents and all of their sub-agents and like whatever platform you have. It would basically mean losing connectivity overnight to texting as a service altogether across Telgorithm or any other carrier. So do you really want to handle that complexity and risk everything every single day? We all know that bugs happen, and like managing a system with like no error rate like that, I don't even want to think about building it. We're doing our own stuff on our own end to queue things so that we don't hit limits as often, but it's great to know that there is a safety net there to prevent the possibility that something catastrophic happens and then you lose access to like SMS altogether.
Right. I'm calling the way I put it. I know it sounds comical, but if you went to like a sandwich store and you paid them for the sandwich, and like, well, over there is the bread, go bake your own bread, go put your fillings over there. And no, my part ends when I pay you as my connectivity partner. That's going to support my 10DLC traffic that I'm spending all this money on. Is that my part is done when I registered. You need to be able to handle that on this side. And that's how we see that by as a default. And just sliding over here, because I know we're really up on time, and again, really appreciated. If you could slide over to the last slide here. Just to summarize your experience with Telgorithm, and as somebody that is currently in a scenario that you were in with Telnex, what would you say someone watching here today that's kind of on the fence, number one, switching a provider, but also into looking at Telgorithm, or why they should at least have a conversation with Telgorithm?
Yeah. I would say that you're going to get access to detailed support from an engineering team and have like a proper understanding of how exactly things are going to get approved, how campaigns are provisioned, how things are provisioned, and have the safety net when it comes to going slightly above limits if it ever happens on your application, because it's queued on the other end as well too. So not only are you going to get a proper understanding of how exactly this entire A2P 10DLC system works, which changes the way that it works like weekly almost, depending on like which carrier releases something, but also you'll understand how to get things registered so that you don't have to go through appeals and revets the whole time. And in the case that your own application goes through and past the limits, that it won't break everything or disconnect you altogether.
Awesome. And no, this is all great. And so again, and one other final point here. Sometimes, obviously, Telgorithm is newer to the industry, although we're
Mhm,
already more than 3 years in. What would
mhm,
you say someone that's on the fence? I don't know that, they're a little bit of a newer vendor. Again, based
mhm.
on your experience here, would you say that that's a non-issue and why that was a non-issue for you?
Yeah, and I don't think that is an issue at all in the slightest. And I know that like the industry in general just thinks that older by default means better. But what
Right.
we've noticed in like in a lot of places, not just with telecommunications and carriers, but also with databases, with programming frameworks, is that newer might not necessarily mean worse, and that older might not necessarily mean better. Older sometimes just means set in their ways enough that they're just iterating over the last possible percentage, making better horseshoes for the horses instead of building the car. And like you switch over to a new provider that just did that one tiny thing at the start different, and their entire network or platform is better because of it. And I'd say that Telgorithm is the prime example of that, and their support level is miles ahead of anything that you can get anywhere else.
Awesome. Greatly appreciate you taking the, I know we have extended time today, but
Mhm.
this matters because Telgorithm is truly here to help. We're in the trenches with you on the bottom line, and we're looking to get the word out, really to truly help businesses. And that's a win-win for everyone. So really appreciate, I know that you have a busy day and not always easy to get on the front stage and share the spotlight here to discuss things like this, but really appreciate you doing that and letting our audience know, and the broader industry knowing your experience with 10DLC and Telgorithm in general. Again, thanks so much for joining, Samantha. I don't know if you wanted to wrap something
Mhm.
here, but
Just no, thank you, Andre. That was amazing. Thanks for sharing your story. Aaron, thank you as always for leading. And thank you to all of our audience. We appreciate you sticking with us. We hope you enjoyed as much as we did.